This time on Falmouth in Focus, so near, yet so unfamiliar to so many. Just an hour or so away by boat, a funny-shaped little island has cycled through some wildly different historical identities. At times, a doomed destination, and at other times, a doorway to scientific progress. We're headed to Penikese Island on Falmouth in Focus, and it starts right now. Hello and welcome to Falmouth in Focus. I'm Michael Kasparian.
And I'm Eileen Preston. This is our monthly deep dive into just one topic. And, as Michael said, we're headed to Penikese. If you stop folks on the street in Falmouth and ask them about the island, the results are likely to be kind of hit or miss. A relatively small minority of people will even know where the island is, right?
True.
And most people know even less about the island's dramatically fluctuating history.
That's right. It's gone from experimental science classroom to a place of exile for people once called lepers, to a reform school for wayward boys, and now, once again, it is a place of scientific discovery. Our exploration is guided by Kimberly Ulmer, the executive director of the Penikese Island School. She told the story of Penikese to an audience at Nobska lighthouse, including her modern-day efforts to create a space of learning and inclusion. And she took our camera on a boat ride to the island to accompany a visiting class of university students.
What is this place we're talking about? You kind of have to squint in this image to find her. But Penikese is this small 75-acre island located at the southwest end of that Elizabeth Island chain. I feel like people say Cape and Islands and they really mean Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket, and they kind of forget about this Elizabeth Island chain. So Cuttyhunk is probably the most well-known of those Elizabeth Islands. Penikese is located about 1 mile north of Cuttyhunk. Penikese Island is owned by the state. It's a wildlife sanctuary, so it's open during daylight hours to the public, but you have to get yourself there. We, the Penikese Island School, our campus is private. It's ours, as is the dock. So, we have our sign that says, dock at your own risk, hoping that legally covers us. And the school owns a vessel, and so we can take like 24 passengers on it. And so we have captains that drive it. You're looking at one of the captains. And the oceanographic has generously let the school keep a boat in one of the slips. It's right by the drawbridge. Our boat's name is the Richard Edwards, some Jaws, because there's this classic photo somewhere. It's of Richard Edwards, who was recruited as a dynamite expert for when they blow up the shark in Jaws. And so there's a picture of him with dynamite sticks in his teeth inside the Bruce, the shark. He worked for the oceanographic, and he was sort of integral in the 70s to the original founding of the school. And so our current vessel is named for him. If we look at an aerial view of the island, you can see that it's comprised of two main lobes connected by a very narrow isthmus. It's predominantly a grassland. It has predominantly rocky beaches, but a mix of sand and rock. Now it is mostly a grassland, but it was originally fully forested with pitch pine and cedar. And it is now operated as a wildlife sanctuary and owned by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So Mass Wildlife uses Penikese as a nesting site for seabirds, both for gulls, and predominantly their focus is on the roseate terns. In 2019, we shifted to our new mission of environmental education. So we're now focused on inspiring environmental stewardship, trying to just showcase different faces of science in different areas, different fields of science. There's an academic component to what we're doing, but there's also the whole sort of social, emotional aspect.
Some of these bones may be actual seagull bones. We'll see carcasses along the way of seagulls that finally, you hope they died of old age. My name's Eric Larson. I'm a lecturer at the University of Chicago in the biological sciences. I've done most of my work in the West. So this is all outside of my area of expertise, but we basically use universal methods of data collection.
Right now we're doing some comparisons across the island, looking at invasive species. The students have developed projects looking at native versus invasive blackberries.
While we are surrounded by horseshoe crabs and mice and all sorts of freaky aquatic insects, our professor has reminded us multiple times that this entire ecosystem is maintained by active human effort, that the rest of the Elizabeth Islands, at least formerly, were forests. And Penikese in particular was originally deforested by 17th century British settlers and has been maintained deliberately as a grassland for the purpose of ecological study. And so although we are very much in nature here, and we hear seals at night and all sorts of rodents, run before us when we go through the brush, this is a human-built environment. And I think it's worth noting that you can do meaningful ecological research in a human-curated environment. And it's worth remembering that nature and human activity are inextricably connected, whether we're aware of it or not.
It is a privilege to be here. This island has had many lives.
The first written record of Penikese comes from the year 1602 when Bartholomew Gosnold sailed in these waters. So Gosnold is he gets the credit for discovering this area. He named Cape Cod due to the abundance of cod at the time for the English to establish new colonies. And we also know that the Wampanoag people were living here for thousands of years before Gosnold sailed in these waters. Penikese changes hands quite a few times. And what we mostly see during this 1700s and into the 1800s is that the forest is denuded and it is turned into a grazing habitat for more sheep farming. So in 1873, we have a very short but a really impactful moment in Penikese's history. And it was currently in the hands of the gentleman on the far right with the sort of grand mustache. And that's John Anderson. So John Anderson was a wealthy tobacco merchant. He saw an ad in the paper, and he was a very philanthropically minded, wealthy individual. And he saw this ad from the more severe-looking gentleman on the left, Louis Agassiz, a sort of famed Harvard professor of geology. He really wanted to establish a permanent school where you could study zoological science amid the subjects of your study. Agassiz was sort of tired of, wearing the three-piece suit, memorizing everything in Latin indoors. He was like, we should study nature in nature. And so he sort of coined the phrase, study nature, not books. And John Anderson said, okay, and he gave Agassiz the island of Penikese and a $50,000 endowment to create just such a school. So he quickly goes about sort of converting wealthy John Anderson's buildings into dormitory, laboratory, classroom space, lecture hall, dining hall, and it sort of just comes together for the summer of 1873. And they had 44 students. A third of the students were women. Agassiz is really well known for his science, but his legacy is sort of marred by his controversial racial theories. Not super progressive in all of his thinking, but he did allow women to come, and pretty remarkable that a third of the students were women. And I just want to highlight one alumni in particular, Cornelia Clapp. So I love this quote. I had an opening of doors at Penikese. I looked and saw 1,000 new doors. Everybody was talking, discussions in every corner. I felt my mind going in every direction. I'd never heard much theoretical discussion before. I had a turnabout face the next year after Penikese. I wanted to teach then. Cornelia Clapp went on to be a zoology teacher at Mount Holyoke. She went on to be the first woman to get her PhD in biology in the United States. And she was the first female researcher and eventually a trustee at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole. So this is from a few years later, 1895, but I just adore this image. I feel like it perfectly captures that sort of Victorian era of naturalism where they're, hitching up their skirts and they're out studying nature in nature. And then in 1905, the state purchases Penikese for $25,000 to create the Penikese Island Leprosarium. Islands are a wonderful way to isolate people, and so Penikese was chosen as the site to send people with what we now call Hansen's disease. And there literally was a wrought iron gate to separate the infected side from the clean side. And these patients were mostly sort of captured at immigration, so they're coming from other countries, they don't speak any English, and they're just shipped to Penikese. The patients did some light farming, they kept a vegetable garden to feed themselves, but they also planted flowers. So to this day, daffodils will bloom along the foundations of their cottage walls, which is just so bittersweet. When they closed the Leprosarium in 1921, they burned all the buildings, they even dynamited some of the buildings. The fear of contagion was serious. All that's left are the foundations, and then this was the laundry building. I'm not sure why it was not a wooden structure, but poured concrete, but it remains. And I love the beautiful lichens growing on it because I can ask the kids, what's growing on the side of this structure. And the image on the right is the graveyard that's there. So in 1921, the Leprosarium is closed and the island's for sale. Who wants to buy a former leper colony? Anyone? Any takers? So nobody goes for it, and so some people like to say the state gave it to the birds. In 1973, the Penikese Island School is founded, and George Cadwallader, David Mash, Herman Bosch, and Carl Jackson are sort of the critical formative characters that formed this original school. And the mission was quite different than it is today. It was to be a private rehabilitation school for teenage delinquent boys. And the goal was to, teach and lead by example and to sort of model upstanding citizenship in this, very Spartan environment. And, there was nothing there. The hurricane had washed everything away. Nobody lived there. So the boys lived on a barge at the beginning, and they had to build the buildings. And so they learned about woodworking. Even once the structures were complete, they still did boat building. The cook stove was wood-fired, so if you wanted to eat, you had to chop wood. To this day, we still heat all of the structures with wood stoves, so if you wanted to be warm, you had to chop wood. This programming was year-round, so they had a garden, they had chickens, they had pigs. The state funding for this eventually was not available, and there was some new leadership, and it sort of shifted to some substance abuse programming in the sort of early 2000s. And then there was a period where the Penikese Island School didn't have any programming going on. And in 2019, we shifted to our new mission of environmental education. We really learned with COVID that kids are stunted in the social emotional area, that being isolated and not with each other really hindered their growth and their progress on these sort of social emotional interactions with each other. And so getting them out of the classroom, shaking up sort of the normal classroom dynamics, they're going to a place where basically no one has been, nobody has any prior knowledge or hierarchy, and they sort of collectively explore and discover. And it's really a beautiful thing to see.
Michael, I love that. Have you been there to Penikese Island? I've never been.
I have actually been there. I think it was about 18 to 20 years ago when it was functioning as a place for, as was said, wayward boys. When there were students that were out there, young men who were out there working and trying to rehabilitate themselves. It was a fascinating program that was there at the time. It was a short boat ride over. I really enjoyed it. I spent the day over there. Actually ate with the young men that were there, and it was pretty eye-opening.
Wonderful. Well, it's a wonderful place to learn, and now this new evolution of it, Kimberly Ulmer tells us about.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I love the diversity she's trying to pull in. She's trying to pull in lower income people, people of all ages. Tiny Tots will be there, trying to get older people to go as well, and women as well. Push them into STEM more, make everybody feel comfortable learning science.
Yeah, it's wonderful that the island is being used for something so important and it didn't just end up being abandoned.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful destination to get to, so when those people are going over for the programs, it's a fun boat ride. You get to see a lot of the natural scenery and everything around. Just glad that it's continuing on. So,
yeah, fascinating stuff. And just a quick programming note before we go. FCTV will be airing that presentation by Kimberly Ulmer as a full-length feature in its own right. So check your favorite platforms or go to fctv.org/watch for schedules. That's going to wrap up our show for the moment. I'm Eileen Preston.
And I'm Michael Kasparian. We're back soon with our usual roundup of local events. Until next time, we'll see you around town.